The disruption to oil supplies through the Strait of Hormuz was a major shock to the global economy. Prices surged, governments scrambled for emergency supplies, and many feared the crisis was only getting started. But then something unexpected happened. After the US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding in June, remember that was the starting point for negotiations, oil markets stabilised far faster than anticipated, and at the centre of the story was a dramatic drop in Chinese oil imports. But why? I put that question to oil analyst Rory Johnston.
China did save the global oil market, and the most concerning thing about it, aside from the fact that we still don't fully appreciate how they managed to do it, we have even less visibility on the why.
So Johnston says China slashed its crude oil imports during the crisis so dramatically that it helped offset the supply shock coming out of the Middle East. The result of that was a feared global energy crisis never fully materialized. So what exactly did China do? And did Beijing quietly save the global economy?
The one thing I and other analysts did not expect was the scale of import retrenchment in China. So Chinese crude oil imports fell by roughly 45%, roughly 5 million barrels a day from pre-war levels to the levels we saw average through June. That is gargantuan. That is larger a shift than the entirety of the world's SPR releases combined.
SPR stands for Strategic Petroleum Reserve. These are emergency stockpiles of oil that governments keep on hand for major supply disruptions. So what Johnston is saying is China's drop in oil imports was larger than the oil released from the entire world's emergency reserves. 5 million barrels per day is a huge number. So how did China manage to pull it off?
And that's just from China. And the striking thing about it is that we still don't fully understand how they managed to pull it off. This is still the number one mystery amongst oil analysts in this oil market, because the pace of apparent demand destruction, because China doesn't publish official numbers on demand, so we infer demand based on flows into and out of the country. On that apparent demand basis, China looks like it is in the midst of a massive depression or a COVID-0 lockdown like we saw in 2022.
But wait a minute, China isn't in a depression, and it hasn't imposed a COVID-style lockdown. That's what has analysts scratching their heads. A collapse in oil imports on this scale should have been accompanied by a major economic shock. Instead, it appears China somehow absorbed the disruption without the economic pain many expected. So what are the possible explanations?
There are those that argue, I think, that the Chinese system has become so flexible between, electrification and, we know that they have, global, world-leading EV penetration rates in sales. It's still not enough, in my opinion, to account for the swing, but it's there, right? We know that they've been driving to reduce oil dependence in the first place. Also in petrochemicals, we know that they have all these swings. So the one argument is that this was a natural response to the market. But again, I think while maybe you could account for some of that under a natural response, the response has been too large and has lasted too long. Again, if it was natural, you would have expected as crude markets softened, that we would have seen a resumption of buying. And again, we haven't. It feels like someone has said, don't buy oil right now. But the best explanation seemed to be at the time that they were storing a lot of, diesel, gasoline, et cetera, under the potential risk scenario that they were cut off from global supplies.
So maybe China has been stockpiling, but it's also important to stress that Beijing has spent years trying to reduce its dependence on foreign oil through electric vehicles and alternative energy sources. Johnston says that alone doesn't explain what happened here, though. The drop in imports was simply too large. In fact, even as oil prices began to fall, China didn't rush back into the market the way many observers expected. So what else could explain this?
There could be the altruistic interpretation, which is that Beijing wants to kind of silently help the rest of the world. The US put particularly Asia in this horrific bind, this, energy insecure crisis that they could have, only in their wildest nightmares. And that, the implosion of the Asian economy broadly would be bad for China, particularly given the fact that China is attempting to diversify away from dependence on the US market, given the trade wars, towards Asia and Europe, the two areas that were going to be most hurt by this Hormuz crisis. So there's one argument that could have been, something that they were doing to try and, both support potential allies, but also, I think, even from a self-interested perspective, support alternative markets outside the United States, which was going to remain relatively insulated from this crisis, given North American energy, oil and gas production.
Right, so in other words, if China deliberately reduced its oil purchases, it may have been acting in its own economic interests. A major energy crisis would have hit Asia especially hard, and Beijing had plenty of reasons to avoid that outcome. But Rory Johnston says there's another possibility, one that's far more speculative and far more geopolitical.
Then there's the kind of more potentially nefarious kind of, I'll be frank, kind of tinfoil hat kind of interpretation here, which is, and I think we have to consider it, which is that there was some kind of secret deal struck between various governments. We know that the Trump administration was in Beijing through this crisis for a very high-profile talks. We didn't think much of it at the time. They did not seem particularly successful. You had no major announcements coming out of it. But it was around that time that you did see China pulling back most aggressively on its crude imports. Was there some kind of deal struck? We don't know what was in exchange, but there's something that Trump could have asked Xi Jinping to say, support us in terms of what China could have received in exchange. This is where we go to, maybe theorizing along the lines of the so-called Dun-Roe doctrine, which is, this idea that Trump has been trying to carve the world into these spheres of influence, that the United States was going to get the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. He was going to largely cede kind of geopolitical interest of Europe and Eurasia towards Moscow. And then Asia was going to kind of be left over for Beijing. And what did we see through this crisis? We saw, given the scale of damage to US military assets in the Middle East from Iran, we've seen the United States military transfer a bunch of military equipment from Asia, from, let's say, Taiwan, back to the Middle East in order to kind of buttress defenses there, which would support this idea that, long gone are the days of the Obama era, Pacific pivot. And this is kind of a US retrenched. And I think that could also serve Beijing's long-term interest. But very frankly, we have no firm evidence of any of this, which is why it remains this massive mystery in the market. All we can do is speculate until we get more data.
Now, I'm going to stress this. There is no evidence of any secret agreement. But the timing raises obvious questions. As diplomatic talks were taking place, China was making its most dramatic cuts to oil imports. And whether that was a coincidence or not, Johnston believes it revealed something important about China's influence over global energy markets.
One interesting thing is that we often talk, when we talk about China in energy markets recently, we typically talk about how Beijing has had a concerted effort and kind of a clear policy priority to dominate renewable energy technology, the systems of the energy transition, photovoltaics, lithium-ion batteries, everything else. And typically, one of the things, the dovetail to that has been that the West has actually been relatively stronger on the fossil fuel side, that China is well known to be fossil fuel poor, the largest importer of these fuels. But what we've seen here could be a demonstration that the same concerted policy effort they've put into dominating energy transition supply chains has been equally applied to the fossil fuel supply chains, and that this kind of Western belief that, particularly in North America, I'm in Canada, that North American and Western fossil fuel dominance has become this geopolitical playing card, and it has. But it looks like China has also worked to kind of erode that potential advantage as well, that they are covered, they are ambidextrous across the kind of energy space, and they're showing it in real form right now.
If Johnson is right, then this crisis may have revealed something much bigger than a temporary shift in oil markets. It may have been a demonstration of China's ability to influence global energy supplies without needing a single extra barrel of oil.
So I think overall, China is a clear winner here. It has clearly demonstrated that it can cut back, that the world's largest crude oil importer can cut imports by nearly half and have very little effect immediately on its economy. That's a kind of a superpower in the global oil and global energy market.
Johnston believes China emerged from this crisis stronger than many expected, but Beijing isn't the only winner.
I do think it's pretty clear that Iran is a major winner out of this crisis. You did not have any kind of Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz coming into this war, and they are leaving it in a dominant position.
And what about the losers from all of this?
I would say the biggest losers in my mind in many ways are the Gulf states. It's been shown, while, the UAE is actually also, I think, actually seen impressive performance through this, given their ability to not just reroute through the pipeline to Fujairah, but also dominate this kind of dark transit and trade that emerged, this shadow transit trade that emerged through this crisis. But Saudi Arabia is looking more chastened. But obviously OPEC lost the UAE through this crisis, arguably the single greatest political wound to the producer group in its history. So I would say that Saudi Arabia seems like a pretty big loser through this.
So not everyone emerged stronger, and we can't forget that. Beyond the geopolitical winners and losers, we need to remember the human cost of this crisis, particularly in the global south. Rising energy prices contributed to higher food and transportation costs around the world, worsening food insecurity in many countries, which has put millions of vulnerable people under considerable economic strain. Now, that's a consequence we can't afford to overlook. We still don't know exactly how China managed to navigate its way through this crisis with what appears to be no significant damage to its economy. But if Rory Johnston is right, maybe they also quietly saved the rest of us from a far worse crisis. I'm Pablo Folilias. Thanks so much to my guest, Rory Johnston, and to my producers in Berlin, Hannah Hummel, Joel Dulroy, Aaron Tilton, Leon Jutta, Melanie Marker, and Stephen Habig. I'll see you very soon.